Oh, well, hi attendees in listen only mode. We are just giving a couple of our panelists some more time because we had a little bit of a snafu with our communication and scheduling on my part. And so folks are going to be coming in. I will, where's the, okay, so just walking through this, Danny usually does this part, so bear with me. If you have any questions or any comments, you can put those into the chat. And so once our presenters are done talking, we will have the opportunity to get to any of your questions. And if the Michigan GAs have any questions that came in ahead of time, right? Like typically the GAs like handle the questions there too. So we'll get at it. We're, as you know, we've moved to Michigan, so we have a whole new set of faces under the hard hats, and this is our first trial run at a webinar with our new organization. So it might not be as flawless as Danny has made it in the past because he had a lot of practice. But we are fully confident that this is going to be a great conversation, and we're happy for those of you who logged on because, as Yanero was saying, like it's like for us, it's the last day of the semester. Some of you were out last week, right? But everybody's tired. Everybody's tired of webinars. Everybody's tired of Zoom, and I had really kind of wrestled with this whether we should do a webinar. So we've never done a December webinar, and we've never done a conference debrief webinar. But because it was online, I had really more time to kind of think about what was happening, right? Instead of it, when you're in person at UCEA and you're just running, right, all of the time. And then you do all of your thinking afterwards, and sometimes that takes me until January. But because it was happening in process, and because we had that fantastic presidential reception virtually like that, I think that was so cool. And so we had gotten into a conversation there, Bill and James and I, about the meaning behind the speakers and how they were selected and the thought that went into the conference. And so I really thought that it would be a good idea if we started doing kind of a conference debrief, because this year nobody had the opportunity to really talk right with one another while we were there. But secondarily, I think that it's good for people to understand how the process works, what people are thinking about, because for those of you who are grad students, you're going to be faculty one day, and you will probably be involved in conference planning at some point, right? Whether through UCEA or AERA or other organizations. And so I'm very, very pleased to have two of the four right now. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bill and let you introduce yourselves. Oh, there's James. Hi, James.
And Rosa's online, but she's having technical difficulties with her camera and microphone.
Okay, and for some reason, I see James listed as Bill Black, so there are two of us here. And perhaps even Rosa, I see in the chat listed as Bill Black. That in no way is intentional, nor is it intended to be colonial in any way, shape, or form. I'm not sure what happened, but
I know what happened, Bill. You send them the link, and it's an individualized link.
What happened.
We each got our own link.
Well, we are a team, and we worked as a team, so we will make it through. And this is symbolic of our year of planning and the ways we've had to pivot as we go forward. So I'll just start with a general introduction about the process and how we do convention planning, and how I came to consider what ended up being the greatest planning committee ever, and invitations for my colleagues, Yanira Olivera Ortiz from UT Tyler, James Wright, who is not Bill Black, that's listed there, from San Diego State, and Rosa Rivera McCutcheon from CUNY Lehman College. And so welcome to all. I'll just start with a very quick introduction I believe Rosa is here, and she's working through some technicality, so she will join us shortly. This is very reflective of the year we had and the kinds of pivots we had to make, and the flexibility of the committee. So to just take a step back with UCA, our governance, typically we have, as you may know, what's called the executive committee. There are 9 members of the executive committee. From the executive committee, there is a president that gets elected, there is a current president, and then the past president that then serves as the treasurer for a year. So we have people come and serve in these positions for 3 years in order to create some stability and some ways of sharing knowledge. So this last year I was president-elect, so Gerardo Lopez, who was the president, who had the presidential address, and I met, discussed the convention, what the convention is like for him in his process, as well as Carl Gilner, who's been the behind the scenes superhero of all of our efforts, working diligently as UCA staff to help make this happen. So I would sit with Gerardo and say, okay, what's the process like? And he says, one of the first things you will need to do is to create a convention planning team and then come to create a call for the convention. All conventions have a theme. We'll discuss a bit of the theme. I'll turn it over to my colleagues to perhaps introduce our discussion of the themes in a couple of minutes. But one of the important things is those help us to, when we start thinking about a theme, it's what is it as a team we want to highlight as what is happening in the discipline at that time. Now, the theme doesn't mean that, and this was a discussion we had, that if your proposal doesn't fit exactly in the theme, that you will not be able to present at UCA. That is not what, it isn't that exclusive in terms of guiding the criteria for acceptance, but we wanted to create a team that then could come together and articulate a theme for UCA at the time. And we knew that the convention at that time was going to San Juan in Puerto Rico. So what I think has been exceptional about our team and the ways we came to it is because of the kinds of pivots we had to make, we met a lot. We met just about every Monday. We discussed the theme for a while, and then discussed how do we pivot with the theme. Once in May, we had to go to a virtual convention. But as I thought about this, I reached out to people to help with the planning around potential themes. And being in Puerto Rico, what sometimes happens is a president-elect may have folks that they know very well that they end up working with. Well, I knew Yanira because I was the editor of the Journal of Cases and had leadership. She had submitted a case there from her work in Belize and had known her work through JCEL, but really didn't know her personally until we're sitting at the plenum last year, and she's sitting behind me and says, you know, I'm from Puerto Rico. If you need any help in planning the convention, I'd be willing to help. So that initiated a set of discussions, and we were very fortunate to have Yanira join the team. She took a leap of faith and came on to the team. Similarly, I had known Rosa in passing and had known her work over time, knew her connections to the Puerto Rican community in New York, and that's a very important part of considering the place, but also the critical bent, intellectual bent that I knew we wanted to take around the theme. So I gave Rosa a call, and even though she was on sabbatical, she said, okay, I'll step up and do some of this work. And I'd actually known James from interviewing for a position. I'd known him briefly from UCA, from his work as a Jackson Scholar and his presentations as a Jackson Scholar. Known him and had a really great interview with him for a potential position when we had one available, and knew he was doing a work on a special issue for EAQ on coloniality. And talking to Gerardo, I knew that because Gerardo Lopez is the editor of EAQ. And I said, you know, given where I'm thinking we want to consider this notion of belonging in home, but in a critical bent, this might be worth a conversation. So I called up, emailed James. James, as a very well socialized Jackson Scholar, said, I have a lot of things on my plate. I'm not so sure. Let me talk to some of my mentors as to whether this would be a good idea. And of course, I tried to leverage as much as possible, saying this was really a nice way to get some of your emerging scholarship and the special issue out in a broader environment. And so we were fortunate to have James join our team as well. So our very first meeting was a set of introductions as a planning team. And that then helped to guide our initial discussion. I had planted a seed around this notion of membership and belonging, and having known James's work and how it related to Rosa and Yanira's work as well around coloniality and the production of knowledge, we started our conversation around what is belonging, what does it mean to be a member of UCA? And this was happening at a time when UCA had a new executive director, was moving out of UVA to Michigan State. UCA had shifted direction over time from a small group of universities, about 30 universities, we're now up to 110 universities. It looks different. We are centering social justice conversations of access and equity. And so what does it mean to create a space of belonging? And knowing that that was not perfect, knowing that there needed to be work and continues to need to be work in that area, it helped to generate some of our initial discussion, which was fairly robust and rich in terms of our first task, which was to write the theme into a call for proposals. So we could take the shape of what was a previous call for proposals and rewrite it. So we began, and like most academics, it ended up being, oh, we got pretty much work, but we got a deadline to get this in 48 hours. Boom, 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 can we get this done? And, you know, I think James was up late doing some revisions and I was in early. So we ended up getting that, but it was only after, I'd say, a month and a half of conversations every Monday. So I will just stop there and then maybe ask my colleagues to reflect on or think about what was the nature of our conversations at the time when we were thinking about building a theme for the convention.
Well, I'll jump in. I remember some of the conversation, because my work is really focused on instructional leadership, and as a former school principal, I really struggle with the sense of belonging in higher ed, because this is my 27th year in education, but only my 7th year in higher ed. I spent my first 20 years in the K-12 system. So I think that that's where led a lot of my thinking as we, when, we had the conversations about belonging and being from Puerto Rico, and my sense of where do I belong? Do I belong in Puerto Rico? Do I belong here? Because I left after high school and haven't really lived there since. So it was very interesting. I really enjoy the conversation, our conversations, especially, hey Rosa, because Rosa and I, being Puerto Rican with very different backgrounds, it really challenged my thinking about Puerto Ricans in the island versus Puerto Ricans, in the United States. So the conversation was really so much deeper than just thinking about what are we going to, what is the theme of the conference and what is it, but it was really a lot about what does it mean for me as a Puerto Rican in the States and as a former practitioner in higher ed. So it was really thought provoking and really enjoyed, and I really enjoyed it.
James?
I think you're muted. Are you?
Oh, okay, yeah. So what I would say is, I think the first thing that happened when Bill reached out to me was, like he said, I was practicing what I had been taught to do, which is don't ever, accept an offer. As good as it sounded to me, in my mind, there was no way I was going to turn it down because it sounded really good. But I did want to consult because I wanted to consult with some other folks who knew better, who may have went through the process in the past, just to kind of get a handle on all that it would entail. But even though I was excited for the opportunity, and my initial thought was absolutely yes, I still took the space to think about it. And it turned out to be, in spite of all of the turmoil and all of the the changing of plans and whatnot, it turned out to be a really good experience. And then the other part, I think, and then, Bill mentioned, he and I were in, I believe he was chairing a session that I was in, or I think it was a Jackson Scholars event that I presented at, and Bill was, I think, chaired the roundtable or something like that, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And then a few years later, I met Bill again, as he mentioned, through as an interviewee for the position that he had open. And then again, after I got on here at San Diego State, I met him again at UCEA. So it was interesting. It's interesting for me to see how my experiences as a Jackson Scholar, and a senior guy like Bill, a professor like Bill, who I didn't realize that him taking his time to hear me out as a Jackson Scholar and review my work or make comments on my work as a Jackson Scholar and a grad student, and then later, be gracious enough to have conversations with me, during my interview with his institution, and then to follow up a couple of years later and ask me this was actually at UCEA, and where was the last UCEA?
New Orleans.
New Orleans, right. So in New Orleans, we were in a session again, and then shortly after that, he contacted me. So the point is just the ways in which Jackson Scholars, set me up as a young graduate student to meet a senior person like Bill, and not even know that a few years down the line he would look at me and consider me to be a part of this really significant event. And so it was a good experience for me, and I'm just fortunate and thankful for the Jackson Scholars Network, because it provided me this opportunity.
Hey everyone. I was on from the beginning, but I had to switch computers, and hopefully this second computer won't fail me. For whatever reason, it wasn't working. So my apologies. I did hear everything that was happening, and I was texting my colleagues frantically and trying to figure out what the deal was. So I wanna echo what everyone else said in terms of the process. I think for me, the experience, I had been the program chair for Division A in 2018, I think, and I had been a section chair prior to that, so I had a sense, kind of an understanding of what the process of planning for a conference entailed to a certain degree. It certainly was a different kind of a lift. Even in normal times, I think it would have been a bigger lift because it really was from soup to nuts. I think when we went to Puerto Rico and we were like involved in trying to think about like where the physical, what the physical conference was going to look like and where the reception was going to be, and looking at different venues, that was a level of detail and decision making that I had not had before in terms of the Division A program planning. But I had a sense, and I think James's insight to really to remind himself to pause a beat before accepting an invitation like this, I think is a really valuable one, particularly as early career scholars, and really trying to weigh the experience with the other responsibilities that you have, particularly for James as a fairly newer academic in his tenure track. Yanira and Bill, actually, over the course of our program planning, Yanira got tenure and promoted, so congratulations to her. Bill got promoted to full, so congratulations to him. James and I are just kind of sitting by twiddling our thumbs. No, James was reappointed. So I think it really does. I think in terms of thinking about the purpose of this event today, and really thinking strategically about your future roles as academics and the professoriate, it really is very often trying to manage competing commitments and real interest in the opportunity and the exposure that this will bring, versus a real understanding of what life has in store for you. Of course, none of us realized in February when we were in Puerto Rico, kind of scoping out the location, that within a month, our lives would change dramatically. But I think that it was a really powerful experience, the experience of engaging in thoughtful conversations, and to have the opportunity to kind of dream, to be given a certain amount of leeway by Carl in particular, who was like, if you dream it, we'll figure out a way to do it. And that continued even into the online format. So I do think it was a powerful experience, but it certainly is something to think about, and perhaps think about what are the ways that you can build to that, right? So can you be a section chair? Can you be a SIG program chair to really start to build the capacity to take on a role like the UCA program planning?
So one of the interesting things, so to go back, our first task was to get the planning committee together, then get the theme. Then we went to Puerto Rico to plan and look at the site. Then we continued on with planning potentially to go to Puerto Rico. And then we'll get to the pivot. But one of the interesting things when we think about our theme, right? Going back to that rebuilding home, coloniality, belonging, and educational leadership. The title shifted multiple times as we discussed concepts. As you'll see in the introduction, if you were to see it, it says aims to highlight critical discourses around knowledge production and the control of knowledge. So even though we were talking about what is home, rebuilding home, we started with coloniality and this notion not of rebuilding home through critical discourses around knowledge production and the control of knowledge. And then additionally, the theme highlights concepts of belonging relative to our institutional, disciplinary, and personal homes, nations, ethnicities, and identities, and these relationships within educational leadership. So as we came across this, we had significant discussion, like Janita, I think, referred to, about identities, racial, ethnic identities, identities as scholars, identities as practitioners. What does that mean to a field? But as we reflected on those also became personal, I think, conversations amongst us. And what constitutes home? For me, one of the interesting questions always was this notion of home, right? And as academics, in some ways, you rise in the ranks by moving from place to place, right? Yet our work, if we have community engaged scholarship in these, for me, the relationships matter. And that takes time, but that's often, and particularly with communities that have been marginalized, right? They would have many people that are like me that would parachute in, do what we need to do, get our publications, and leave. And so how do we think of home when institutional norms actually have us create homes in different ways? Sometimes we're almost independent contractors, right, working, and yet I'm finding, and it's even more the case now through this pandemic, right? What constitutes meaningful relationships? And I've always appreciated that for me about UCA, but I know that isn't the case for everybody. And so how do we reimagine that and thinking about home disciplinarily? And that is completely tied into notions of coloniality. So it was interesting how we think about the field, and then we would think out, and then we come back in to think about ourselves and the sort of flights that we would take after that. Our most recent one, Holly was making reference to it, is what is professionalism? What is a profession as such? And by demarcating a profession, does that become inequitable? And does that deny access? And yet the entire history of UCA, when you look at its history, is to demarcate quality leadership, rigor, and criteria of exclusion to some degree. And that isn't always necessarily bad, right? Because we want quality, we want some standards, but those are held in tension. So I just say that as my own reflection, but so we would go out to the disciplinary sort of and broader knowledge production, but would circle back to our own lives as we discussed creating a theme. I don't know if that makes sense, or if other folks want to jump in on that.
I mean, I would also say that it factored heavily into the ways in which we envisioned even holding those tensions in the convention space, right? And what it meant with the physical space when we were going to be in Puerto Rico, in terms of thinking about how we would create home, this home space, UCA as our disciplinary or academic home in some ways, in a place where so many folks had been displaced and had lost home, and then trying to figure out a way to manage that tension within that space, to think about the tensions around how is UCA home, how is educational leadership home, how do we expand the notions of home when by bringing in folks that might not typically participate in the convention, right? Whereas we're typically, and I think Janita spoke to this in terms of the tension around her own identity as an academic versus the practitioner, and why those two things seem to never intersect, or they don't intersect enough, at least in some of our academic spaces. And so I think a lot of what we talked about, I mean, to a certain point, and I think Bill mentioned this earlier when I was having my technical difficulty, really the depth of the conversations, and then Carl kind of pushing us to get to the final, like, well, okay, so great conversations, let's actually write the call. let's finalize the theme, but really getting into some powerful conversations. And I think all of us in some ways experiencing the tensions in different ways, whatever, whatever lenses and our own identities we were bringing into the conversations.
I think too, one of the things that I recall when we were having these conversations in Puerto Rico, just as thinking about what it meant to be home, and we started talking specifically about Puerto Rico itself, and I remember, and Rosa could respond a little bit more as far as like her being a Puerto Rican and being a Puerto Rican from New York is sometimes contentious, and she can probably elaborate on what that, what the broader context to that. And I think, from that standpoint, we started talking about, each of us, being part of the field of educational leadership and, feeling at home or not feeling at home, even though this is really our discipline home, our home as a field. And yet still some of us feel, ostracized or homeless because of, a lot of the different dynamics that Bill mentioned. And so we started thinking about home in that way, just in terms of what it means to be home. Like for me as a Black American, what is home for me, given my lineage and given my history and my roots and my past. That's a conversation that that's how I started to think about it. I think all of these thoughts kind of came together and thinking about how we wanted to talk about what it meant to be home, and then sort of settling on the idea of us being, part of an organization, or UCEA as an organization, and how folks within within the different institutions that bring different identities and different ethnicities into these organizations, and how do we feel, or how does this organization make us feel with regards to the idea of home.
And I think for me, one of the things, home will always be an issue for me, because I feel like I'm from Puerto Rico, but then I go and I'm like, okay, where can I go to eat? Because I have been gone for so long, right? So I think that will always be part of who I am. But as we're talking about the theme, I kept thinking about coloniality and everything that it means, and how unaware or I never thought about it growing up in the island, because of, certain privileges you have based on the color of your skin when you're, in the island, just like in the United States, I guess, right? But it really made me think about my work in Belize, because here I am coming from the United States with this knowledge and these ideas, and they're wanting me to, share and do some work in Belize, but it really made me question, am I just bringing my ideas and the, white America, or white, the 5 countries that, the keynote speakers talked about, but, am I just bringing my ideas into Belize when it really doesn't apply to their context? So it really, it was a lot of thinking about even my work as a scholar / practitioner, in the, it just, there's so many different things that we talked about during the planning, and even, as we got closer to the convention, that really just impacted not only my thinking in the personal level and what I consider home, but also on my work and the implications it has for my work.
Yeah, I mean, to James's point around, and even Yanira and my experiences and being able to kind of compare and contrast. I grew up in a Black neighborhood in Queens. So even when people think of New Yorkers, they're not thinking of my hometown, right? They might be thinking of the Bronx, or they might be thinking of El Barrio in Manhattan. They're not thinking of Laurelton, Queens, which is where I grew up. And so even my connections to like the New Yorican identity, and to cousins and others who lived in kind of those more metropolitan spaces, you know, even that is something that has been a challenge at times, right? And then the spaces in which you feel like you can claim a particular identity and where you can't, you know. So when I go to Puerto Rico, I feel a little less comfortable talking about my Puerto Ricanness because am I Puerto Rican enough for the island? You know, and so the questions of, you know, I think identity, and what it and how identity construction is connected to kind of coloniality, which I'll also say were new concepts for me, right? So there was one of the real benefits of participating in this planning process with this committee was the ability to also then begin to learn about some of the things that I had perhaps thought about, that I was attuned to in different ways than maybe Yanira was, but didn't necessarily have a name or a theoretical kind of framework for thinking about those things. So I credit specifically James with you know, kind of broadening my understanding of these concepts of coloniality. But I do think, and this notion of who gets to claim what identities and in what spaces, I think absolutely they came up in really powerful ways, not just in the keynote speeches. Gerardo's conversations about, you know, his presidential address around UCEA and kind of memory and how we experience UCEA depending on who you are and what your identity is. All of these things really connected. And certainly over the course of the last year, you know, there have been several kind of high profile cases of white scholars who claimed Blackness or Latinidad, and, you know, and have caused quite a stir. So all of these things I think are really, really powerful and meaningful in the ways in which we find our place in the academy. And I think even having been at, and I should also say that I am an ed leadership transplant. So when I first joined a faculty at Lehman College faculty at CUNY in educational leadership and attended an event, I was told that I needed to go to UCEA. I had never heard of UCEA. I'd always only attended AERA as a doctoral student. And so after attending UCEA and getting connected and attending some of the Jackson Scholar events after the fact, right, as a faculty member, the power of being connected to the community through Jackson Scholars Network is so incredible, and certainly something that I'm envious of. But it's such a powerful kind of way to start home, and to create home, to then expand and to shape. I think it's really just another layer of helping us think about, when I go to UCA, the Jackson Scholar events are definitely places where, even as kind of an outsider, non-Jackson Scholar person, is the place where I feel like I am home.
And one of the interesting things, as we got to May and we had to make a decision as to whether we would go to Puerto Rico or not. So one of the things behind the scenes that people, and even I didn't realize, there's some really big economic impacts to certain decisions. And so we had to really look at clauses in the contracts, because if we'd waited a certain time or made other decisions, it really could make have a very big negative impact on us. So we were in kind of this abeyance for a period of time. Then we talked to an attorney. The EC made the decision not to go. Then we had to turn to pivot into a virtual conference. And, you know, again, I think of, all right, when I started, what a great committee to plan our work for San Juan, right? This is a group that could really move forward. You know, I had done work in Latin American studies. So this is a context that I really wanted to return to. I am not an IT person by identity. And so we have to make this pivot. And then we revisited our theme and really said, okay, what can be, do we need to do this? Because we first had this imaginary of it in the context of, in this sort of physical space, right? At least part of it. But when we revisited, we said, actually, no, this isn't the case, right? These same issues of coloniality, power, home, the disruptive nature of disaster capitalism in Puerto Rico, that we could see some beginnings of that potentially happening in the broader United States. The nature of who belongs, who doesn't, how does certain knowledge get privileged, certainly was part of our deliberations with the powerful, not just COVID crisis, right, but anti-Blackness crisis in the country that was so evident. So we actually revisited the theme and almost came back to, no, we don't want to change this. We were asked, we could, so we edited it a bit, right, to update it, but we didn't change it. So I don't know, that was striking too. So we found it meaningful because it also applies to this broader rebuilding of home in this new turmoil that we were in, some of which was absolutely not new at all, right, which relates to coloniality and how we think of the world. And we'd already begun the conversations, primarily James making the contacts with our two keynote speakers who had, you know, significant desire to go to Puerto Rico. That's their where they identified as Puerto Rican. And so, but again, if we go back to the, I think the addresses they have, it transcends that space. And in some ways, we were talking, in some ways, it's even more powerful given these events that we've had this year.
And I think too, what was fascinating, you know, for me, and I think it came out, it played out in a way as well, was the fact that we were in Puerto Rico, in a place that some Puerto Ricans will tell you is still a colony of the U.S. in some respects. And, you know, that word is frowned upon, and, you know, other folks would argue that. But some Puerto Ricans will tell you that that's the position that they're in, this sort of throwback way of imposing upon another, you know, people and their and who they are and their, you know, and their politics and everything like that. And so just being in Puerto Rico and admiring the work of folks like Ramon Grosfogel and Bonilla Silva, and then it just seemed like a shoo-in to ask them if they'd be a part of, you know, of the convention, because a lot of their work speaks to a lot of the ideas that we talked about, you know, in terms of knowledge production and who gets to determine what knowledge is and who gets to determine what knowledge gets to be left outside of the margins. And so, you know, we started having these conversations around these ideas and in the space of Puerto Rico itself. And so it was, you know, disheartening in a sense once it was determined that we wouldn't be going to the, you know, to the island, that we would be doing it through Zoom. But I think, as Bill mentioned, you know, keeping with the theme, you know, we tweaked a few things, but by and large, I think that, you know, it was just in hindsight, I think it was a really good idea to keep things the way they were. And, you know, in spite of the fact that we weren't in Puerto Rico, it still had the initial feel that we set out for it to have.
So thank you all for sharing. I just was looking at the time and I see that there's a couple of questions that I'm seeing in the chat box, but I appreciate the depth, right, with which you've shared your thinking in and around this. And I also appreciate the fact that you've connected this into good mentorship practices and understanding how to create that space of home and belonging within UCEA, which, you know, many people can feel is not a home space. And so with that, if I have it wrong, I'm going through the chat here. They're alphabetical. So it looks like Amanda has a question.
So we can't, I don't think we can see the
Oh.
question.
I can't.
I can't.
Yes.
I don't see any questions in the chat box. I forgot you guys are all on listen only mode. This is a terrible way to run. Dang it. Oh,
Yep.
wait. Did I just, okay, I am unmuting people. So if you have a question, if somebody wants to test it out, you should be able to now if you unmute. I'm wrong. Okay. So I guess you guys can text me if you have questions, right? Because I'm pretty sure everybody in the world has my. Okay, Amanda says no questions. See, she got ahead of me and I'm just saying hello.
We do
So-
have a couple questions that
Yeah, I'm
we
gonna.
generated on the GA side.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I
And,
can go ahead
Colin,
and
I
ask.
unmuted. Can you hear?
Mhm.
Okay, you can unmute. I'm just helping with the technical stuff, but I did not have a question. I'm just happy to see all of you and hear your comments and learn so much about the background. I just had a comment that I found the keynote speakers to be the best I've ever heard going to UCEA. And it gave me so much hope for our organization to have keynote speakers that spoke to the topics the way that they did and with such passion. And it gave me even more hope as I was in my first year of being an assistant professor and had heard some very negative comments about keynote speakers from the prior convention that were speaking on about marginalized populations, and we're part of marginalized populations. And so in the back of my mind, I started thinking, I hope UC doesn't get a backlash about keynote speakers, right? And continues this journey of bringing these conversations we have in our own cultures and our own homes to the forefront. And so I really want to commend the team and thank you for your hard work, and that indeed we're moving forward and didn't move back to keynote speakers who were not speaking to these issues of the home. Thank you.
Okay, which questions did we have? Do you want to read those for us?
Yep. So I have. Hello, can everyone hear me?
Mhm.
All right. So one of our questions is that we all know that in academic spaces, we're often called to collaborate across different contexts, whether it be identity or institutional context. Your work on this convention is a testament to the ability to collaborate. So how did you all navigate the rapport building and the co-creation in this process? And how do you suggest newer scholars approach that work on smaller scale collaborative opportunities? What did you see as essential to this process?
And nobody's microphone's working? I don't know why mine is working. Oh, the technology.
Oh, now can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yes?
Yes.
I think we have to go to unmute ourselves. I just had to go up and unmute myself.
Oh, okay, now I'm unmuted. Okay.
I mean, this is the first time I've done it. I'll confess I was slightly nervous our first meeting, just because I was, I wanted to spend some time for us to tell our stories a bit and just introduce ourselves to each other. So I think taking the time to do that, even though there were tasks ahead, for me was kind of important in moving us forward. We also had an interesting conversation about how some of our best speakers don't come from within education. Some of the scholars that we draw from don't come from within education, and that can often push the field. So we were very open and willing to look at scholars outside of education for our keynotes.
I would say that I think when the question was asked, you saw all of us smiling a bit, because I have to say, I mean, we all say that we are the best planning committee. We're actually really hysterical. You know, we crack ourselves up. We have a million different group chats, and a lot of that, you know, comes from the fact that we had to meet so often. But I will say, I credit Bill with really a huge part of why we were able to work so thoughtfully together, because Bill really created a space that, as much as possible, was not hierarchical, right? That we were, you know, Bill really wanted to hear from us, wanted our input, wanted us to have some authentic say in the process. And so he created those spaces, as he said, I think a bit modestly, despite the fact that we had some pressing deadlines, because he prioritized the relationship building and the opportunities for all of us to get that. So in terms of advice, you know, you don't, when you're asked to collaborate, you have no idea what the person who's asking you to collaborate, what their work style is. So all you can do is kind of live and learn, and take away from the experiences how you want to emulate those practices or eschew those practices in those spaces. That was my sense. We were really responsive to one another via text, via email, and kept a good kind of humorous, we approached it with a great deal of humor.
I also think, and I'm thinking about this committee, but also, you know, other opportunities I've had. As Rosa mentioned, I was recently promoted, but it's also finding the right fit. Like with us, we didn't have a choice, right? This is a committee, this is who you get to work with. And thank goodness it worked out. It's but when you're at your institution or you find other people, there'll be times that you work with somebody and you realize that is not the person I need to be working with. So you finish that project and you find somebody else to collaborate with. So you have to be your own advocate and not let, especially when you're an assistant professor, not let the senior professor say, oh, you want to work with me? And yes, you say yes because you might be interested. But if you learn that is not the person you want to work with because you end up doing all the work, or because you know, the writing styles are not compatible, whatever the reason, make sure that you advocate for yourself and you say, yeah, no, I'll say no next time. And I really admire James for even from the beginning saying, I need to think about this before I say yes, because that is not something I do very well. But I have learned to say no to when I find somebody I don't think I can collaborate with in the future.
Okay, do we have another question?
Yes, we do have another question. So in thinking about the ideas contained in the theme, especially in this COVID-19 context which has exacerbated and highlighted the visual marginalization of communities, if we're thinking about the great talks and the great sessions that we attended, how do we take the work, as a junior scholar or a younger scholar, how do we take the work that was done in the conference and the work that we heard about in sessions and translate that to meaningful work for communities, especially during this time where we're all facing challenges, but we see that as usual, these challenges work to the detriment of communities who already experience oppression in the U.S.
Can I jump in on this? I think I love that question because it raises some of the tensions I think that we have, that all academics have, or that many academics have, in terms of really, you get to a point where you really want your work to be meaningful in real, authentic spaces. That's not to say that, you know, writing articles and publications that are in journals aren't necessarily real and meaningful. but they do exist behind very often a paywall, you know, an institutional barrier to get to them. And very often practitioners are like, that is not, in fact, we heard that from one of the superintendents early on, was like, you know, translation of our research into real practical work is resources is really important. So I guess my answer would be, you know, as much as possible, I think the work of assistant professors and early career scholars is around being strategic, right? So if you want to do this meaningful work, it usually means that you have to spend the time to develop relationships, et cetera. So you really need to think about how are you serving, you know, two goals here. One is the kind of tenure track goal and whatever it is, the standards of the institution. And at the same time, how can you take some of that work and translate it perhaps into ways that are meaningful? So really thinking about how can something be mutually beneficial as opposed to, you know, something that is just going to sit in a particular space. At the same time, I think actually the question is needs to be directed to those of us who have some level of authority and positional kind of power and privilege within academic spaces to start to shift the academy to reward that kind of work, because it is just as rigorous, it is just as important as the other kinds of work that, you know, shows up in a journal that, you know, 10 people read or 10 people have access, right? So that is, it's up to Bill as a full professor, me as someone who is maybe closer to being a full professor, Janita and James ultimately. It's our job to move the field, to really change the ways in which we write letters, how we offer to support scholars who are going up for tenure. That's our responsibility. It can't all fall on assistant professors.
And I'll add, I'm looking at Bill and James, and they don't seem like they're going to jump in, so I'm just going to jump in. I also think it's so important that you, and I think Rosa mentioned this, is finding that service that you can provide and really take it into the field, but also find a way to make that your scholarship, so you're writing about it. Because that way you get both sides of, okay, I have to provide service, so might as well do something that is meaningful, and then find a way to incorporate it into your research. That's what I did in Belize. Like, my passion quickly became my work in Belize with principals in very rural schools, and then now with the ministry. But I found a way of incorporating my research so I could work on both what I was passionate about in the field as a practitioner and my responsibilities as a scholar.
I also think when you start looking at potential positions, and of course right now it's a little more challenging because of the situations we're in, but look at the institutional norms, look at who is there to help you. When I first went out to Indiana, you know, I was coming from Texas. I had never lived where there was snow in my life, but I went and interviewed there, and the senior faculty said, if the assistant professors don't get tenure, then we have failed in our jobs. It is our job to support you in making tenure. And so finding, and that is unfortunately not the norm. And so finding spaces where that's the case, or who can advocate and understand your contributions, and you could see that moving forward, that can help to support you. I think you have some choices as well in trying to navigate that, and then lean on the senior people that you meet through the Jackson Scholars. Hey, there's a position here. I mean, we also hear this is a place that if you want to get some publications out but never get tenure, go there, because that's kind of what's happened. Here's another place where we know that they tend to really support assistant professors. So lean on your network of Jackson Scholars and mentors as well.
If I could say one last thing, because I know Holly's ready to pull the plug.
You're fine. You're fine.
Whenever you show up, Holly, is about to be something. But no,
In
But
more
if
ways than one, right?
I know. But if I could just say for Jackson scholars, especially folks who are either, wrapping up dissertations or in the process or about to start, one thing that I can say from my own personal experiences, I was very adamant about doing something in my dissertation work that was meaningful for me, that was personal to me and my community and the people that I cared most about. And I was sort of told that it didn't fit within the ideas or the scope of what was expected of the field. And there was a significant amount of pushback that I received, and I was given sort of kind of like pushed into doing something that I wasn't really interested in. But I stuck to my gun. I stuck to my guns. I stayed the course, and I did it. And so, and it paid off. Some folks will tell you, well, no, if you do it this way, you won't get a job. If you do it this way, it'll look, But if it's something that means something to you, and if it's something that you're passionate about, then do it. Don't let anybody, especially as whoever it is, a senior scholar or whoever, have you do something that they want. Like it's not because ultimately you're going to have to look back on it and deal with what you did, and you're going to have to look back on it and either kick yourself because you did something that you weren't really passionate about, or you'll look back on it and be like, well, this is really what I wanted to do, and I'm glad I fought through it and did it anyway.
I think that's actually a great way to end, because the one thing that we know, right, is UCEA has only improved, right, in most ways, in terms of inclusivity, in terms of representation. And I disagree that you have the best planning committee ever, because I believe the San Diego 2015 planning committee was actually the best one ever. My committee, led by Monica, right, and Irene Yoon. But one of the things I would say is, being part of this, right, and understanding how it works, you do create these like lifelong bonds where my planning committee, we're still very close as well, right, through that work, and we all met there in the same way. Okay, so we're running out of time. I had more to say, but I'm not going to. I appreciate you all so much for doing this, and for people in the audience who may not have met you before or may not know you, right? I feel very comfortable. Yanira, you're the only one that I don't know would be welcoming to this, but I assume you would be. These are the types of people who are our mentors. They're the types of people who work in our Jackson Scholars Network. And then once, of course, James has a couple more years to work up, and then he'll of course be a mentor as well. So I feel comfortable saying reach out to these people if you want more information, if you want to follow up, or you have questions perhaps that you didn't want to ask, because I know that they're all very receptive to that. Our next webinar is going to be in January, and I actually didn't write the date down. Doing a terrible job. So it's towards the end of January, and we're going to be focusing, kind of shifting into publications specifically, and actually we can thank Dr. Wright for that as well, because it was largely his idea that these types of things need to be addressed more intentionally. So we have a webinar that will be focused on in particular thinking about journals, but thinking about, again, not losing who you are and not losing what you're passionate about in striving to publish in these very top tier journals. And so we're going to have a conversation with Sarah Wolfen about what those types of journals are looking for and how you can take your work apart a little bit and just give some strategies there. So we would love to have our panelists come join, right? And if you're attending today, we'll get the information out to you. And then we actually have now webinars scheduled every month, and we have the presenters for the most part lined up all the way through UCEA next year. So hopefully we will be back in Puerto Rico. That is the one thing that I was going to say and I forgot earlier. So twice we've had to cancel Puerto Rico, and that economic impact also affects their community. in a really remarkable way. And it's certainly unfair, right, that Zika virus the first time and now COVID. And so we will circle back for any of you who are wondering to Puerto Rico. Again, I know that Monica is very committed to making sure that Puerto Rico gets their just deserved attention, right, in the
2025.
Yeah. Well, let's hope, right? Let's yeah. So thank you all for being here, and we will, if anybody has any final questions or comments from the audience, right, I don't mind going over. I know other people have commitments that I don't happen to have. So if you need to leave. If you have questions, you're certainly open to ask them now, or if you want to comment. No, I haven't led a webinar in a while. I'm rusty here. So, okay, well, thank you. And that will conclude. We will have this available on the UCEA website. So if you want to come back and revisit it, or you heard something that you want to hear again, or if you want to pass it along to other people who might benefit from hearing it, I think that understanding the people who are working within the organization is really the first step to understanding the organization itself.
Thank you, Holly.
Thanks for having us, Holly. Bye, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. Bye, everyone.
Hola, Bill, Amanda.
Hi, Amanda. How are you?
Hi.